God be with you. Wonderful. Welcome to all of you who are here in the room to our final forum of the year, of the program year, and then we'll start back again in September. So very exciting. We've got some great planning going on for that. And welcome to all of you who are joining us online. I'm thrilled that you're here. Whether you saw the play last week or not, I hope you will fully engage this conversation around mass incarceration and the impacts of that. Let us pray. God, whose very being is liberation and compassion and delight in humanity, be present with us this day in our conversation. Open our hearts and move our feet and our vote to work towards justice for all people. May your Holy Spirit be at work among us as we continue to be your people of justice and love in the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And now I'm going to turn it over to you all, to Ariel Fristow and Doug
Amar,
thank you. Doug Amar from the Georgia Justice Project, Ariel Fristow from Out of Hand Theater. And thank you so much for being with us today for this conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you all for coming back today. For those of you who came last week to the play, thank you for coming to that. But either way, we're so glad you're here for the conversation part this morning. As Elizabeth said, I'm Ariel Fristow. I'm the founder and artistic director of Out of Hand Theater. And as you would have heard me say, if you were here with me last week, our mission is to inspire understanding, empathy, and action around social justice issues like mass incarceration and recidivism by producing events that combine art with information and conversation. So we had the art portion last week, and this week we are going to have the information and conversation portion of the event. And we are so thrilled to have Doug with us here today, who's the executive director over at Georgia Justice Project. So we've got the boss, the big guy this morning. And I'm going to start out by asking Doug some questions, and then we will open it up to questions and comments from you. I'm sorry to say that Marlon, our actor, could not be here this morning. He's got a pretty full performance schedule this weekend, and this was one too many things for me to ask. But please, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and questions about the play, as well as about what you hear this morning about Georgia Justice Project. So, Doug, the first thing I would love to know from you are what are the major social barriers to reentry after someone has been incarcerated?
So first, Marty, I'm probably going to go off script.
Oh, please.
Because Marty knows this from last night. So, Ariel, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. We are so honored to work with you guys in the Out of Hand Theater. It's been a tremendous experience. Our staff have really loved it, and it's just a tremendous thing. And we've never done something like this before. So it's really cool. I mean, it's just really cool. So I really appreciate your all's model. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate working with you all. Your team has been amazing. Obviously, everything's been amazing. So thank you for inviting us and letting us be part of this.
Thank you. And this is so neat for me and Doug because we've been doing this together for 6 weeks, and this is the first time that he and I have actually gotten to sit down and do this part together. That's right. Both of us have been with lots of other people.
That's right. And of course, this, as I was telling, this is my, this is where my letter's at in terms of my church, and so my home, as Ann reminds me. That's right. So it's great to be here. I mean that too. So thank you. Let me do this. I'm breaking out this new elevator pitch that I'm reminded last night that is a little long elevator ride, but we're having some folks work on it. So I want to start with that, if that's okay.
Please.
Just so you know, I know a lot of you in the room, a lot of friends, a lot of volunteers. David, my gosh, he's been helping us forever. He's got more stories about us, I'll tell you. But anyway, let me just give you this quick elevator pitch, and then I'll go from there. So when the Georgia Justice Project started 36 years ago, the idea of the idea that the criminal justice system needed reform was a crazy idea. There were no prosecutors or judges in the system trying to keep people out. Since we began, we have helped to transform the criminal justice system, making it a place with more accountability, more justice, keeping some people out of the system and making it easier for those to have a fair shot at a second chance. We've come a long way, but really, we are just getting started. The need for this work is really mind-boggling. If you think it doesn't affect you, you're wrong. In Georgia, 40% of the population have been arrested and or convicted, meaning that 50% of every parent, of every child, 50% of kids have a parent with a criminal record. The system affects all of us, and it's really still not slowing down. At the Georgia Justice Project, we help people from going into the system, keeping them from going into the system. We help people while they're in prison, and we help people when they're coming out as they try to rebuild their lives and extract them from the system, and particularly helping them end probation, some of our newer work, and then remove the permanent stain of a criminal record with the hope of a real second chance. But then, as I always look to David, because he knows he was right there when I'm pointing to David Ross and stuff. You want to raise your hand just because I'm going to talk about our policy, because when we started policy work, David was right there with us saying, "Doug, you're crazy, but I'll help you." Then we take what we've learned from our lessons with clients, and we went upstream to try to change the system. And GJP's policy work has resulted in 22 change laws now, mainly removing barriers to reentry, like expanding expungement, like having a path to end probation, and like most recently, the governor signed a few days ago, a bill that would help reduce driver's license suspensions in the state. We can talk about that too. So lastly, obviously we do a ton of outreach and education to lawyers, to community groups, and to groups like you all, so we're really honored to be here. And that's my preamble, so thank you. Okay, all right, so sorry to go on a pitch there, but I just want folks to know, it's good to know who you're talking to, right?
That was perfect. Okay. Yes, so I'd love for you to talk about barriers,
Yeah.
Legal barriers, social barriers, whichever you want to do.
That's what the lawyers say. Judge, instruct him to answer the question, please.
Yeah.
So the play does a great job of talking about the real barriers. I mean, housing and employment are the biggest barriers, and we see that all the time, that having a job and particularly having income. I mean, we have this debate for years in our office, which is most important. I tend to side on the economic side. I think if people have income, they can get a place to stay. But the barriers to the housing are real, very significant. But those are the two most fundamental things we work on all the time. I was saying last night at Marty's house that we had a client, a woman we represented, followed her into prison, helping her when she's gotten out, and we just were securing housing for her this week. But our social workers have worked very hard on trying to make that happen. So those are the two big ones, but right behind that are mental health, like addiction. The intersection with addiction and the criminal justice system are very significant. About 75% at a minimum of all arrests in the country are related to drugs and alcohol. And so you can't ignore that when you're dealing with the system or the people in the system and how it affects. And so family relationships are a huge part of the reentry process. I mean, that can be very complicated and very complex, but those are just some of the issues that we sort of put our eye on and try to pay attention to.
And what are the legal requirements? What do people have to legally do when they get out of prison?
So the main thing that folks need to do is report. And let me just say, I'm going to quote a bunch of statistics that are in your handout. This bag I handed you isn't just for propaganda. Yes, there's propaganda, but we made this one sheet we've never done before called Reentry 101. And just to give you all some terms, so we're talking on the same terms, but also some data on the front page, and a little bit on the back of what we do with policy and direct service as an organization. So one of the data points is around this is that we say on the page, 99% of everybody released from prison is under supervision, and that means they're on probation or parole. And there's a big driver. I mean, the folks in the system, the probation and parole folk know that they just don't want folks being maxed out, meaning if somebody got a 10-year sentence, you serve 10 years, and you walk out of prison. That happens, but statistically about 1% of the time. So if you're getting released from prison, you are on paper, as they say on the street. You're under correctional control through probation or parole. And that creates a number of layers of requirements. One, you have to pay for that. You have to pay for that every month. There could be a number of other requirements that they put on you. You can't leave wherever you're allowed to go to, like Fulton County. You cannot move to another county. You can't leave the state without permission. You certainly can't leave the country without permission. And while you're under supervision, you cannot vote while you're under sentence in Georgia. So there's a number of legal issues there that come up for people. That's probably the most pressing one, and the one that we see that's the most precarious as well, because so many people go back to prison for violating the terms of probation or parole. But let me stop there. Is that, I could go on. I'm trying to make my answers a little short so we can have a conversation of too much information, so I'll try to keep it.
Okay, well, this might be a short answer. So what state in the United States has the highest number of people on felony probation?
Georgia. And Georgia leads the country. You all know this is in your handout. Your syllabus, students, is in your handout is that Georgia, America, as you all know, leads the world in incarceration. But Georgia leads the country with folks under correctional control. What that means is people in jail, prison, or probation or parole. And so, but we lead the country specifically with probation. And in fact, we have more people on felony probation than any other state per capita, and some, I think, maybe even raw number, I should know that. We have no limitation on probation, meaning the client I was just talking about, another client who actually we saw on Thursday, she got a 30-year sentence on a drug case in Fulton County. I mean, she's back in jail because she relapsed. But the point is, you can give 80-year sentences, 100-year sentences on probation. And that's one reason we have the worst. It goes on forever. And we have the largest number. Let me give you a couple more data points that aren't in your handout, that in Georgia, many of our 35 states around the country limit probation to 5 years or less, including Alabama and North Carolina, our neighbors. But in Georgia, that's not the case. So the average probated sentence on a felony case is 6.3 years. 40% of all folks on felony probation have a sentence of over 10 years. And so we just use this tool to the detriment of, too much. So let me stop there. I'll stop with the information.
Okay, I'm going to go off script for a minute.
Yeah,
Karen,
Karen,
please, if we can.
Why do we have, okay, that's next week. Well, sure, we have to talk about racism, and of course. But of course, that's a great question. I wish I could really answer that. One of the ways of talking about this, I think, is that in the 70s, Georgia was ahead of the curve on what's called community corrections. The idea of having probation, and we're going to put you on probation instead of send you to prison, was sort of a novel concept. And Georgia was way ahead. But like a lot of things, if you're ahead 40 years ago, you're behind 40 years later. And some people who do death penalty work know that is a good example. I mean, there's lots of examples, and not just in criminal justice, but throughout the continuum. So what's happened is what was a leader, where we were a leader 40 years ago, we've become the lagger now. And so that's first and foremost. Secondly, I think this has come up under Governor Deal's reform efforts a few years ago. I mean, folks in the know this is a problem, and they know also the real reason is judges. That judges don't want to give up their power. If you say, listen, judge, we're going to take away your power, we're going to do what Alabama and North Carolina do and limit probation to 3 to 5 years on a felony case. And like, no, sir. No, I like my power. I'm going to use it, right? So they don't want to give it up. And so there's this part of the mechanics of why it stays that way, even when all the folks in the system know it's not good and doesn't work. I mean, people in probation don't like it. I mean, the DCS, they don't like it. Nobody likes it. But yeah, I'm more talking about why it hasn't changed, not sort of why it exists, Karen. So I hope that's responsive. Sorry, I can go on about too many things.
Well, I have another question, and then I want to start opening it up to even more questions and comments from you all. Yes, Elizabeth.
When we have questions, we need to come up to the microphone. Okay.
Thank you.
This is for inclusion for those who use the loop system, and it's also inclusion for our folks online. So I love questions, but come up to the microphone, please.
Thank you. Okay, so this is maybe sort of a two-part thing, and I think this is the last thing I will ask you, unless we don't get enough questions about your services. I will ask about those later. But the final sort of data question, so you named employment and housing as the two top social barriers. In terms of employment, I'd love to know about how many people are employed or unemployed a year after they get out of prison, and then how does having to report in and be on probation, how can that cause problems with employment?
So I can go on and on about employment and the intersection with folks who have a record. And let me just give you a couple data points too. That if you're looking for an antidote to recidivism, everybody hopefully knows recidivism is somebody who gets out of prison essentially and goes back to prison. I mean, that's one way of different definitions, but let's just use that for a moment. The antidote to recidivism statistically is a job. I mean, the data is really clear. Nothing contravenes that number more. I mean, you can stop people from going back to prison by making sure they're employed. You're like, great, well, that should be pretty easy, right? Then, let me give you some more data points. So 60% of folks who are released from prison are unemployed a year later. There's a recent study that came out. It was I forgot who did it, the RAND Corporation, I'm pretty sure, and this one blew me away. It was basically, I'm going to try to get this right, it was actually 64% of men unemployed today have a criminal record. 45% of men unemployed today have a criminal conviction. So you start to see the intersection here, right? It's like, it's really important, but yet folks with a record, that becomes a huge barrier. Let me give you another data point that really will shock you. I should ask if any other lawyers other than in the room, but the ABA has done this study on this about how many states have passed laws, not just how many states, how many laws exist in the country that create a barrier to employment, create a barrier for somebody with a criminal record. And so you think, why would they do that, right? They found out, by the way, 50,000 laws. They stopped counting at 50,000 laws, basically 1,000 per state. Our guess for Georgia is 1,006. 1,006 laws in Georgia that are laws that create a barrier for someone with a record. But here's the kicker. What percent of those do you think, of those either 1,000 or 50,000, do you think affect employment? And when I say affect employment, they aren't creating opportunity, they're shutting down opportunity. Anybody want to guess? I know. All of them. We have some good pessimists in the room. Not all of them, but a vast majority. I'll just go. It's roughly 60 to 70% of all those laws create a barrier to employment. So I'm just painting the scene here that employment is so important, yet there's so many obstacles. But was that answer? No, I'm just sort of laying the groundwork to give you something.
Yeah,
what was your question?
I'm wondering when someone, like for instance, this was something that Ermis said a couple of weeks ago that really stuck out to me, that I don't know much about when people are on parole and they have to regularly check in with a parole officer. How does that interact with trying to keep a job?
I'm sorry. Now get to brass tacks.
No, this was great.
Sorry, trying to set the stage. You'll have some data to work with. So it's a real deal. So here's the deal: when you are on parole, just like the play, you have to report, and especially those first few months, a year and a half, 2 years out, and often you have to report in person. I mean, the parole board, the parole or probation is only open like 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and they say you've got to, I have a job. You've got to be here before 5 o'clock on Tuesday. You're like, but I got a job and do you want to go back to prison? You've got to be here before 5 o'clock on Tuesday, and if you don't report, now there's a chance you go back to prison. So first of all, it becomes this way. It's a very sort of rigid system, first of all. Secondly, even when probation officers will say, well, I'll come to your job. And we've heard employers tell us this, and even though they're willing to hire someone with a record, someone who just got out of prison, they'll tell probation, do not come. If probation is going to have to come check on you here, we're not going to give you the job. Because it's disruptive, it singles you out, it creates all these layers of tension, and they said, we're not going to do it. And it just takes away from the raw workforce time. But I think it's deeper for a lot of employers. And then there's the cost. You've got to pay for it, of course. And so many times people, and then there's a requirement that you have a job to be on probation or parole. You're like, okay, now this is getting sort of Kafkaesque, right? How does that? You're saying I have to have a job or I can be revoked, but I got to report during work hours, and it just becomes this often really difficult situation. And I mean, we've helped many of our clients navigate it, and it's kind of crazy. So we'll take our clients, and especially the first few months after a case is over or someone gets out, we will make sure to take them to parole. And we will offer that intervening part, because if a parole officer or probation officer knows there's someone else they can call and say, hey, Doug, Billy didn't show up for his appointment, and we're like, hey, thank you, we're on it, because otherwise they're just left to say, Billy didn't show up, now I'm going to issue a warrant for Billy's arrest. So we work with this on lots of levels, and we've seen it play out lots of ways. And let me say this, I don't mean to paint the probation and parole department as like villainous or anything. This is just a really broken system, and that many of us and many of them are trying to fix. So I'm sorry, is that
That was
responsive?
perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm sure you all have questions for Doug, and I would also love to know. Oh yeah, and also please, and I'm going to say this one especially for Marty because she just hosted a performance of this play in her home last night, in addition to seeing it here last week. So yes, thank you to Marty.
I have to listen to me twice.
But in addition to questions for Doug, I would also love to hear your reactions to the play. What do you remember? What stood out to you? So yes, please lead us off.
So I have two questions, and feel free to answer either one or both. If you could ask the folks in this room and the hundreds of folks watching online to spend 1 hour on this issue, and assume we've already seen CAF, what would you urge us to do for that 1 hour? And the second question is similar. If St. Luke's could get you a billboard at the Grady Curve for a month, what would it say?
Wow. Well, that's a great question. Who planted this guy? My God, that's great. That's great. Well, I mean, the first one's pretty easy. I mean, and that really would be policy. So let me, just so you know about us, we've been around for 36 years, as you heard, but for 25 of those, almost 25, we just did direct service. We just serve people. And that's still the biggest thing we do, the biggest thing we do. But as David well knows, we decided to go upstream about 15 years ago and change policy. And praise be to God, honestly, we've been, I always quote you, David. You said, Doug, if you get one bill passed in like 5 years, you'll be amazing. That'll be amazing. So we've been very blessed. We have been. But there is so much work to do. There is so much work to do. And what we found, and this has been really amazing, part of it just because of the times we're in, is we found a lot of people willing to use their social capital to help move the needle legislatively. And I mean that like at the highest level. So I heard made reference to this driver's license bill. Let me give you one quick a couple data points here. 200,000 people a year get their driver's license in Georgia suspended for debt. 50,000 of those people go to jail for driving on a suspended license. We got involved in this, working at this new prison for the last 4 years in Georgia and helping guys re-enter, and we found out that half of the population of this prison, and therefore half of the population of the entire prison system by extrapolation, and none of my DOC friends fight me on that data, they say, have a suspended driver's license for debt. Well, how do we get this? We got this bill passed. We're a lowly nonprofit legal group on Edgewood Avenue. How the heck did that happen? I mean, Microsoft came in and just helped tremendously. Both chambers of commerce, Georgia Chamber and the Metro Chamber, we've worked closely with. In fact, I just gave a talk at the chamber this week with about 30 businesses. And the fact that what I'm telling you is that your 1 hour could help ally us and move the needle, because when the legislators know that the average person or the average business cares about these issues, and we do couch most of these reforms around getting people back to work, because that's the biggest issue. Again, you heard work is preeminent, but it's also what the businesses care about as well. So we need your help. Whether it's the probation work or the expungement work or we can talk about all the work, the plans we're doing. We're getting ready, we're doing some really cool things, 2 more things coming out of the ground. We need work to help move the needle legislatively. And that's probably the easiest way for someone listening to help, and or your spheres of influence, churches, work, community groups, because it really makes a difference. I really mean that. So let me say that. Secondly, a billboard. That's a great question. That's a great question. For a while we did have some billboards working with a couple of groups around voting, and particularly around there's a huge misperception in the world, in Georgia, around the country, that if you're convicted of a felony, you can't vote, and that's not true in Georgia. And so we had this effort, I think you were called off paper, get your vote on, because being on paper means being on probation or parole. So there's a lot of misperceptions about when people can vote. So if we really want to help move the needle at the legislative level, we also got to get people to vote and realize they can vote. And I would almost say that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions out there, and people don't understand. We do a lot of training and education about this, even do voting registration for the formerly incarcerated. So that's one big one. But let me just say, I think, I don't know, I'm going to have to think about it more, but what I would say is, I would really like to have some very philosophical thing that would, is that we've given, in a place that doesn't believe in state power and authority in the South generally, we've given the state immense power and authority in one area, and that's this. We've said, no, we don't want you in our schools, and we don't want you doing this. Don't tell us when to wear a mask, but, oh, you broke the law by whatever definition, total control over what happens. And that doesn't serve most people most of the time. And the best example I know is around, is really the lack of restorative justice that doesn't happen in the criminal justice system. Is that people who are victims often want a different outcome, but it's not availed to them. People who are victims are often of the same socioeconomic class of the folks who are doing the harm, but a redemptive opportunity is not given to them. So the state takes all that power and says, we got it, we're going to punish, we're going to correct, and we're going to send people to prison, and we're going to have a lot of dramatic consequences.
And that could be for driving when your license has been suspended because of debt.
Right. That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. So I would almost like to shake people up to get them, but that's much more. That's more than a billboard. That's more like a philosophy class, I guess. I don't know.
Oh, and just before you go, so just to be clear, so you can't vote while you're under
Sentence,
which means probation. While you're on probation, you can't vote.
That's true.
But once you're done with your probation, you can.
You can.
Okay.
And yes, and we had a long talk about that last night. We can talk more about it if you want. There's more
Okay.
questions, but yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so back to systemic and structural racism. What percentage are people of color? And then listening to the driver's license thing, which means you didn't pay your bill, is also systemically against folks who have less economics choice. So talk a little bit about how we work on that relative to empowering folks and reducing the systemic racism. And what are the numbers?
The numbers are staggering, and at every level. We use a lot of. If I were given a talk and I had use of a PowerPoint, I'd have a bunch of slides that would freak you out and charts, and because one of the slides we use shows the percent of folks, African Americans in the state, and white folk in the state, and the white folks and African Americans in the prison system, and they're exactly. It's exactly what's in direct proportion. We did the numbers on probation are even more staggering. Even for Fulton County, there's there's a 2x ratio, differential ratio for African Americans who are in the population and African Americans who are in prison, right? And the inverse happens for white folk. It's really a cross. It's an X right in the middle. But then you start looking at other systems, and particularly probation. Probation, you think, oh, probation, you're not going to prison, we should all be happy. No, right, first of all. And in Fulton County alone, I think the ratio is over, I think it's a 4x ratio differential between if you're African American versus white, you're on probation. Around the state, it continues even worse in some counties. But driver's license, this data is not collected at a statewide level, but we did a good job of trying to go in various states and various counties and municipalities. And one data point really blew us away because we were trying to find, and it was actually a southern county, in the metro area, I can name them. And the 7-to-1 differential if you're African American about getting stopped and getting a ticket versus if you're white, and that's when those things. So it just starts compiling, right? It's just like you're likely to get stopped, you're likely to get a ticket, you're likely to get on probation, you're likely to go to prison. It just continues. It starts from the very beginning of the system, from policing all the way through the courts, into prison, into release. So the race plays a factor, of course, in all this, and we all know that. And I'm so thankful you mentioned Brian Stevenson in your sermon this morning, because a good friend of mine, an old friend, and love his work trying to bring attention to this issue. Sorry, I'll try to keep my answers brief. I apologize.
Good morning. I'm a small business owner, and one of the first things my administrator does when we want to hire someone is do a background check.
Oh, can we talk?
And so what I wonder, I think that's because she's been doing that for 30 years. Yep. And so is there something or some place or some program where businesses can learn how to do that differently?
We did it twice last week for 2 different chambers of commerce, one in Athens and one here. And this, we were being asked to do more and more because we get that question a lot. What can I do? What are the, that's a whole nother class. We do a ton of training on this and work with a lot of businesses. And we get asked a lot more, especially about chambers and local business associations and workforce development folk, as to how to deal with this. How do I do this briefly? I know. So my guess is that if you're like most business owners, you probably have a rule, and I'm not asking you, but somehow your filter, as they call it, your filter for hiring, even if you subcontract it out to another company, there's probably a layer that says, if you have a felony, we're not going to consider you, which is a pretty common, a felony conviction, right? Not a misdemeanor conviction, a felony conviction. And some companies just say a felony charge and we won't consider you. But let me dive into this. Let's just assume that's your rule for a moment. I have no idea what your rules are. And I would love to talk to you about this. For the rest of the group, when I say felony, you say what? I say felony, you say murder, violence, right? Somebody got hurt, right? Most people. So therefore, employers just translate that sort of general assessment and say, well, if they were charged and convicted of a felony, we could never have them work here because. So now let me ask you this. In Georgia, and I have the data on this, in Georgia, what percent of felony convictions are violent felonies? What? 5%? Well, see, Marty's not. You all look good. I mean, that's good. But yet most of you said you say felony, you think violence, right? But the reality is in Georgia, it's less than 10%. Less than 10% of all felony convictions are violent felonies. The vast majority of felony convictions are property and drugs. Yet when it comes to employers, they put this quick overlay and say, we can't consider you. The other thing, even if you ask, there's often, and you know the rules on the EEOC, I'm sure, the EEOC rules, especially from 2012, which, see, I'm going to go deep in, I'm trying to go, I'll be glad to talk to you about this, but let me just, I'm so glad you asked, and I'm so glad you care, and a lot of employers, and the reason often, really a lot of employers are interested in this now is because the shortage of the labor pool. So we work with this one guy who's out of the Fifth Third Bank, Jeffrey Kurzenik. He's an economist, and we work with the Federal Reserve here on that and had a couple of events. And he's put out a book called Untapped Talent, where he just breaks this down nationally and says that if we keep, as a country, as an economy, if we keep people with felony, he's even focused on that. Jeffrey's an amazing guy. But he says if we keep people with felony convictions out, first of all, there's a lot of assumptions what that means. And two, is it basically says you're keeping 19 million people out of the workforce. And the vast majority of those folks never even went to prison, right? So they took a plea, or sitting in jail, there was a drug case. So all these misperceptions we have about keeping folks out of the workforce and keeping our workforce safe are really premised on assumptions, and the numbers are very high at what it means to the economy and what it means to individual businesses. So we have a lot of data on that, and I'm sorry if this is too much. I'll be glad to. I know I can go on and on about this. I'm sorry. It's terrible.
So this is for Ariel. So what motivated Out of Hand to commission this play? Because I happen to know that it was commissioned with a local playwright, or he was local at the time, because he showed up at my house last night, which was such a treat to finally get to meet him. But how did y'all get involved in this issue? How did this come about?
Thank you, Marty. So we decided 5 or 6 years ago that we were going to center all of our work at Out of Hand on 2 pillars, racial justice and economic justice. And so that's sort of the foundation of all of our work. As a lead-in, another foundational piece of our mission at Out of Hand is that everything we do in collaboration with community organizations, with subject matter experts like Doug and GJP, with government agencies and schools and businesses. So those are what we're looking for when we're looking for projects. And in looking around at the unfortunately many topics that we have to choose from in racial justice and economic justice, we really looked at mass incarceration and then all of the sort of things that stem from that, like the barriers that people face when they come out of prison, that so many people face because of this escalating problem of incarceration. That one really stuck out to us as like, this is one of the most important issues for our community to think about, for us to engage in, learn about, hopefully engage in, emotionally care about, and then do something about. So that one was an easier choice for us than some of our other projects of like, this is something we absolutely want to work on. And then working with Georgia Justice Project has just been such a treat. We work with a lot of community organizations, and each one is unique, but they are definitely not all this responsive and wonderful to partner with. So I'm really sad that today is the last day of this collaboration. And I'd love to know from anyone who saw the play last week, just what stood out to you, what surprised you, or what do you remember from it? And then I'd love to hear that, and then we'll take one more question, and then we will end. Yes, please, can you come up to the mic?
So I worked for the Georgia prison system for 30 years, and I really appreciate, Doug, your inability to capture something because there's so much more to say. It's hard to just single out a particular piece. I absolutely was blown away last Sunday. I came in to the room not having a first foggy note of what was going to be happening. And I have to admit that I came in with very low expectations, just because this is such a huge, that actor did such a brilliant job of capturing the scope and the passion and the anguish of a person coming out of our prison system. It was difficult to sit. It was difficult to breathe. I have never heard this parish hall as quiet as when he was standing up there, moving through all of those characters and putting that just terrible situation in front of all of us. I don't think there was a person in the room last week that, if asked to go out and do a thing, wouldn't have gotten up from their chairs immediately and gone out and done it. So I just can't say enough about it. And I'm going to add one more thing at the end. Much of my work in corrections had to do with women in prison. I had the privilege of writing the state's first strategic plan for women in prison. How will Georgia handle women in prison? I would love to see a similar play done with a woman as the actor.
Okay.
Because the issues are complex, and they're different. They're really different. So thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Wow, thank you. And let's have our last question or comment.
I do have a question.
Sorry, Doug.
Thanks so much. This is such wonderful information, and I know we've been talking about the people who have been in prison, but obviously there are families. There are families and friends and loved ones, and I'm sure you have some data on all kinds of impacts, their housing situations, economic situations, and so on, and this is my assumption, how devastating that is actually ends up being to all of us because folks are in these situations. Thanks.
Yeah, that's right. Bye. Thanks, Kev. Yeah, oh boy, that's a big one. Well, it came up, Marty Susstein, a little bit, just about the impact, and about a criminal record. And again, when I talk about the system, somebody who's been arrested or charged has a criminal record. And that creates a barrier. And one of the biggest barriers it creates, again, back to the two fundamental where we started, housing and jobs. But for families, I mean, one of the biggest impacts that somebody having a criminal record is on housing. And we have worked, in fact, the reason we got so into criminal records work, which is the biggest thing we do, we serve over 1,000 people a year alone just in that area, and then talk to another, and actually counsel probably another 4,000 or 5,000. It varies every year, but it's a huge part of our work.
And this is expunging criminal records?
Right. It's like, can we expunge, like, the 1,000 people who are actually getting the record clean, but then we actually advise another 4,000 or 5,000 about, like, well, this can't happen, or go do this. I was actually, some of the lawyers in the room know Charlie Lester. He's a famous, everybody knows Charlie Lester. He's a great guy. I was on the phone with him on Thursday night about a guy he's working with at his church who has this pretty long record, and he's going to help him do the pardon application, which is very involved and very extensive. So there's lots of ways to help, even if it's not a straight expungement. And I was having that. So we do lots of things, either directly or advise, and we're going to help Charlie with this guy and walk through it. My point only is that housing is one of the biggest issues. And the way we got to this work 20 years ago more deeply was because of housing. And we got asked by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Zeiss Foundation to show up when they were tearing down public housing projects, project-based Section 8 or public housing straightforward, and that there were every of those encounters we've been asked to show up, half of the population of those units were being denied a housing voucher because somebody in the family had a criminal record. And so now we're asked to do the same thing with, we're being asked to get involved with in Thomasville Heights and Forest Cove for the same reason, because they're tearing down Forest Cove, and so we've been asked to sort of show up because all those folks are being relocated, and then half of them, more than likely, have a criminal record or have somebody in the family. That's probably even a low estimate, but still. So housing's a big deal, and it came up, and talking to Marlon last night, you know, I will say it because he said it last night, you know, he grew up in public housing, and he had a brother, you know, that had a criminal record, and he couldn't come live with them because of criminal. So I mean, it's a real deal. I mean, if you have a criminal record and anybody in the family, you just can't just drop in on another family that happens to have a lease, or especially in public housing. So there's so many ramifications to family and the loss of connections. One of the things we do, and we had another volunteer at our office last night, who one of the ways she's been volunteering through her church, and this goes back to the earlier question, for 20 years we work with two churches, First Pres and Hillside Pres, about taking our clients' families to visit them and visit our clients in prison. And families can only visit on the weekends. They can only, we visit during the week. We get in as lawyers, even when our social workers go in. The point only is that family connection is a huge issue. And most prisons are scattered to here. They are not where they're where the dirt is cheap, right? You don't put a prison where the dirt is expensive. You put it where it's cheap. And I understand that. So that means that there's only about 2 or 3 prisons really within an hour's drive of Atlanta. After that, you have to get 3, 4, and 5 hours away, you know, pretty typically, or at least 2.5 to 3 hours. So that means families can't visit. And so the connections are lost. And I'll end on telling you this one story, I guess, because it's one of the first cases I worked on when I was a volunteer 32 years ago in the office. And it was a murder case, a guy from the West Side, a young guy. He got arrested at 16. The case went to trial at 18. Drug trade, turf war, you know, the classic stuff that leads to most violent crime is drugs and turf war, and you know, anyway. So we try the case, one of the first cases I work on as a young lawyer, a year out of law school, and we lose. He gets 2 life sentences, and he goes to prison. And his son was born while he was in jail. And so for the next 30 years, we visited him. Well, we stayed with him in prison. And we brought his family to visit him, and his son. And his girlfriend, who's now his wife, and his sister. And Willie is his name, and actually Willie and I spoke at the cathedral right before COVID hit, and George Maxwell, another good St. Luke's person, had us come up and speak for something. And Willie talks, I mean, you know, we lost his case. We tried hard, but we stayed with him, and that was part of what we do. But he really credits our ability to connect him with his family. And his son is doing really well. His son went to college for a few years, didn't finish, but has a job and is solid, is reunited with his family. And those connections are so easy to lose while folks are in, even if they want to keep them. And I think Willie reminds me of the power of just first of all, how hard it is to stay connected, but the power of staying connected. And his son credits a lot his connection to his father with helping, even though his father was in prison for 30 years, of helping him stay on track. So I'm just hitting at some highlights, Cappy. It's a great question. I'm sorry to, you know, so.
Please join me in thanking these 2 wonderful groups.
And just before you go, we really need your feedback in order to continue this work. It's a pretty new model in the world, and so the data is really important to us. So just before you go, I'm hoping you could take 2 minutes to take out your phone and point it, open up your camera, point your phone camera at this QR code. There should be a website that pops up. Touch the website, and it will take you to a 2-minute survey to let us know what you thought of this program, of the play and the talk. We're looking for your feedback on the combination of these things. And I can walk around.
Never seen the room look like this.
Let me know if I need to come closer to you, because I know this is pretty far away.
And
Okay, yeah, let's go for this side of the room, and then we'll go for the other side.
And you all can continue casual conversation, but several of us need to go to church too.
Great.
So please come to church.